Okay, welcome back. Some more of Nikolas Cruz's interview with the police detective as he talked about his childhood, talked about his upbringing, and sort of some mental abuse that he described happening. At the end of that clip, he's sitting alone there in that room, one of many moments in these hours of videotapes that were released where he starts talking to himself saying, "I want to die. You're nothing but a worthless shit, dude. You deserve to die." Jesse, what's your first impression now that you've joined us here, seeing him sitting there in that hospital gown, rather distressed? Talking about, you know, his worthless childhood, he felt stupid, all of that.
So from a regular person's perspective, I think it's fascinating. We're listening to the words of this shooter, trying to understand how could someone have committed this crime and trying to get in his mind, as frightening as that is. On the other hand, I'm also looking at it with a legal perspective. I'm an attorney. So I look at it and I'm wondering, is there a path for an insanity defense? And then I'm also wondering, if they don't go with the insanity defense and he's ultimately found guilty, would a jury look at this as maybe mitigating factors in a death penalty verdict? And that's what I'm looking at. I'm trying to understand what is going on in this mind. Now, he is clearly a deranged individual, but does it rise to the level of having a mental disease or defect that would excuse his behavior? Would it be a defense? And I think that that's a really interesting avenue to explore, because there's interesting tidbits that would support it, and then there's ones that wouldn't support it.
So you mentioned the death penalty. Prosecutors want the death penalty in this case. His defense attorneys, the public defenders, have said he will plead guilty if they take the death penalty off the table. So far, prosecutors have said no. So in your mind at this point, are we set to go to trial?
What is their incentive to drop the death penalty? This is a slam dunk case for them. Everybody knows about it. By the way, how tough is it going to be to get an impartial jury, especially now when this just was released? You know how tough that's going to be? But they have no incentive to drop this and say, hey, we'll give you life in prison. This guy murdered so many people. Well, allegedly, excuse me, so many people. But the evidence is so strong against this guy. You hear him in the confession. So their incentive, if they didn't have a slam dunk case, they said, you know what, maybe we'll take death penalty off, we'll get a guilty verdict, we'll get him life in prison. But they need to make an example, and I don't see it anytime soon that they're going to drop that.
Yeah, I mean, good point. I want to talk more about this and also what you think in terms of the effect on the families when there's a trial, what Cruz's attorney has said. But of course, it's time for a quick break, so stay with us. We'll be right back. We'll also have today's top crime stories and much more from this Nikolas Cruz confession tape. Stick around. We'll be right back. So that last story, pretty interesting. Those Black Lives Matter protesters obviously upset over the shooting of Stephen Clark, an unarmed black man, decide to show up on the officer's wedding day. Jesse, was that going too far in your opinion?
So it's important to have the conversation. This can't be happening all the time. It's constantly in the news. But if you're working for Black Lives Matter and you're trying to put your best foot forward, is this really the best way to get your voice out there? Now, they said, look, we want to get them where they're vulnerable. We want to get them when they're not prepared.
Right, they're not being violent.
Right.
They're not, showing up with signs and chanting during his wedding ceremony. I mean, we're not exactly sure. This seems like it was maybe while he was getting ready with the groomsmen before.
Right, yeah, you see their outfits out there. But again, is this the most legitimate way to have this conversation? And I'm not sure, because why are we talking about it? We're talking about it because it seems we're questioning whether or not this was appropriate or not. I'd rather have a conversation where it's not a question of it being inappropriate, but I'd like to put them in the hot seat, the officers, and say, look, Black Lives Matter is doing the right thing here. This is a questionable circumstance. I mean, you're crashing a guy's wedding. I know the officers have had to get additional security detail because of what's been happening. They've had death threats. And again, is that the answer? I mean, they have to have a question here. I know the shooting is still under investigation, and it should be investigated. All the officers involved should be investigated. But the question is really this the right way to do it? And I'm not entirely 100% sure.
Were they breaking the law in any way? I mean, presumably this is a private setting, trespassing, anything like that?
What, disorderly conduct, something like that. Even if they were violating some sort of law, some sort of ordinance, the question is, would anybody press charges here? No, because the political fallout of that would look awful. Yeah. And they're not going to, there's nothing illegal about it.
Yeah, one other little tidbit we talked about earlier is that prosecutors, the police department has not released the names of this officer and the other officer involved in the shooting of Stephen Clark, but the Black Lives Matter protesters did. Does that raise any issues, or these guys' names will probably eventually come out anyway? But obviously, in the beginning, their department, their prosecutor seeks to shield them.
Clearly, it creates a danger that I don't think we want any more violence on any side. So if, God forbid, something should happen to someone in this video or one of the officers, Black Lives Matter could have some explaining to do. They may be held liable, they may be held responsible, because otherwise we're blacking out their faces where their names haven't been released. But if you have a group who is taking that first action of releasing the names and placing someone else in danger, that's a proactive step. That's a problem. Again, you don't fight something bad with other bad things. You want to try and get on a different playing field. And I get it. This is a horrible situation. You had a 22-year-old unarmed African-American male who was shot. And why? We don't know. And that's the problem. And we need answers to that. But you want to do it in the right way. So again, I'd rather be having a proactive conversation and a productive conversation as opposed to questioning about this ambush.
Yeah, well, definitely valid points there. And that case still making its way through the legal pipeline. The wheels of justice are slow to turn, right? But obviously we'll be keeping an eye on that to see whether or not prosecutors decide to bring charges. In the meantime, let's get back to our top story today, and that is the confession tape of Nikolas Cruz, the Florida school shooter who prosecutors say killed some 17 people at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School back in February of this year. Cruz, you see a picture of him there at a previous court appearance. After the shooting, he allegedly dropped his guns and ran. Police later found him nearby. They brought him in. They proceeded to question him for some 12 hours. Earlier this week, the transcript of that interrogation was released, and yesterday, a judge ruled that police had to release the video of the interrogation as well. We have listened to a bunch of it already. This morning, we have started to hear Cruz talk about the voices he heard in his head, being depressed and upset, considering taking his life several times. We've heard him talk about buying the guns, how he went about buying the guns. Lots more interesting stuff to get to here, so let's go ahead and hear some more. Nikolas Cruz, the Florida school shooter, talking more about the voices he hears in his head, these demons, and at various points we hear the detective who is interrogating him, Detective John Curcio, sort of doubt whether these demons are a real thing. At one point he even says, I think you're using the demon as an excuse. Jesse, what do you think? Obviously this is something that would come up in trial, the legitimacy of these voices and whether or not in fact he heard them, but the detective is raising doubt, and before I get your reaction, he's not the only one. Take a look at this tweet. One of the victim's fathers responding after watching the confession, calling it a bogus confession, saying, you know what, and he was interviewed on Fox News saying this guy didn't have voices, this was premeditated. He had plans, as he writes, to record it. He broadcasted it to the world ahead of time on multiple occasions and in multiple venues. He begged for someone to stop him. So, and as I said in his TV interview, he really cast doubts on these demons. What are your thoughts?
I think everyone can agree he's a very disturbed individual. Whether or not he's actually hearing voices, we wouldn't know. Now, before it goes to trial, he's going to be evaluated by a psychiatrist and have different mental evaluations, probably get a PET scan, see if there's abnormalities in his head. We cover that constantly here on Law and Crime. Yeah. And it'll be difficult to prove, but again, the insanity defense for his defense attorneys is very, very, very tough, especially in Florida. But you have a guy who, if he's really legitimately hearing voices and felt that his actions couldn't be controlled, it'd be an interesting narrative. The problem is, after looking at this, it looks more like he knew what he was doing was wrong and that he could control his behavior. It's a spectrum. Is someone an evil individual or so mentally disturbed that they couldn't control themselves?
Right.
That a jury will have to decide. But looking at this, it's hard to say.
Hard to say, right. How can we ever really know what was going on in his head? And you raise a good point. There will be many mental evaluations, and if this does go to trial, I'm sure many mental health experts on the stand. Of course, this has sparked a whole discussion about mental health and who missed the signs, so on and so forth. Much more to talk about. This Nikolas Cruz confession tape. We're going to take a quick break. Stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Law and Crime. I'm Stacey Delikat. Thanks so much for being with us here today. Jesse Weber is in studio with me on the other side of the table. He's helping to break down everything we're talking about today regarding the Nikolas Cruz confession tape. Of course, Cruz, the Florida shooter who went into Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School earlier this year in February with assault rifles. He killed 17 people. Prosecutors say they now want the death penalty. We are continuing to listen to some of his videotaped confession or interrogation when he sat down with the detective in the hours after this shooting happened. So far this morning, we have heard some key points. We've heard him talk about his troubled childhood, sort of the depression and angst he has dealt with, several suicide attempts he said that he made. We heard him talk about how he shot chickens and animals as a child. A lot of disturbing details. And now we're getting into the part of this interrogation where he talks about these voices in his head, a demon, as he calls it, who he says made him do this, told him to do this. Let's go ahead now and listen to some more, and then we'll come back out and break it down. All right, welcome back. There we hear more about these voices. The detective in this case really pressing Nikolas Cruz. Detective John Curcio, do you hear the demons now? Does the voice like me? Is the voice telling you to do this? First of all, what do you make of the detective's interrogation technique here? Is it effective?
I think it's very effective. We've seen this here on Law and Crime constantly about, even in the Anthony Kirkland case, you try to let the defendant, the suspect's guard down, which he's trying to do. He goes, hey, I know you like guns. You wanted to be a ranger, man. We got people like that who like guns. The more you can let somebody's guard down, the more they're going to give information. Right. And that's what we want to understand. It's very tough to understand what's happening in the mind of Nikolas Cruz. It's a scary place, and we're getting a little glimpse of it. But we're trying to understand what's really happening and what maybe he might be making up. So we talk about the voice. There's a part of me that believes it might be true. But then when I hear these kinds of things like the voice is telling me not that he doesn't like you, I'm a little more suspicious. Call me cynical, but I don't know. There's something about it, and he's trying to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know, when he said, oh, just the voice like me, and, you know, and then he says the voice is telling me to cut myself, you know, we don't know. Are these voices always in his head? Do they pop in, you know, every now and then? It's hard to say. I'm wondering, though, you know, there's no lawyer in there. Mm-hmm. I believe it was much later on that Cruz eventually asked for an attorney. Do you think he just didn't know who to call? You know, what do you think what happened? He's a young kid. He's very distraught, obviously, over the shooting and everything that's happened.
That's a real quick point, and maybe we'll talk about it on the upside of the break, is he made a video beforehand of the shooting, really excited for it. Right. Here he's so remorseful and wants to die. It's a really interesting snapshot of this guy and trying to understand who he is. So trying to explain why he didn't lawyer up.
It's a good point. We're going to talk about that juxtaposition, the before and the after, but we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with much more here on Law and Crime. Stick around. Well, some disturbing video there of Nikolas Cruz as he finally did ask for an attorney when the detective left the room, presumably to make calls on that. We see Cruz, who's, by the way, shackled by his feet to the floor and to his chair, trying to reach down for something, his head down. He's scratching himself hard. We also see Jesse punching himself in his head, saying, you know, why didn't he kill me? Why didn't he protect me? Not sure if he's talking about the voices. Some disturbing stuff there.
I'll take the perspective that it looks like he was trying to find something to kill himself with. I mean, it looked like he was trying to find something sharp to cut his wrist, as disturbing as that is. It's very clear from watching this tape that this man is very mentally disturbed. But the question is did he have a choice? Really, that's the question under a legal perspective, and that's kind of what the detective was saying. Well, if you knew you had this voice, there were ways to get the voice out. Why didn't you turn to medication? Why didn't you speak to somebody? Because you like the voice. So if he liked the voice and liked what the voice was directing him to do, that's a choice, and that's going to be extremely critical in a case, a trial moving forward, because if he had a choice and he wasn't ultimately controlled by these mental disease or defects that he may or may not have, that becomes the ultimate thing, because somebody who has a choice and chooses the evil path, they have a really difficult time convincing a jury otherwise.
Although, I mean, this is obviously something that will come out in trial, if this goes to trial, you know, that the system failed him. That's what his attorneys have said already. You know, he has a public defender, Howard Finkelstein, saying, look, this video just shows that the system of mental health, professionals, educators, and police failed to stop Cruz in the years leading up to the carnage. So, yeah, the detective saying, why didn't you get help? Well, the argument is these people around him, you know, some tried to get him help over the years. It seems that although he said he did not ever get mental health help, that in fact he had seen a psychologist a number of times, there had been a lot of red flags. So I think that is going to come out. How did the system fail here? Yeah, that is one of the biggest questions of this whole tragedy. I mean, there was an opportunity to Baker Act him, you know, institutionalize him for about 72 hours against his consent, which they should have
done. There were signs were there. I believe after you read about this guy, he tried to kill himself on multiple times, maybe swallowing gasoline at one time too. I read that as well. But if you had that, why didn't they commit him at an earlier point? Why didn't they supervise him? Why was he able to get these guns and commit this horrific crime? That became the biggest conversation in the days leading after the Parkland shooting, and even today. Why did this happen? Why? And especially now, when we're looking at this interrogation tape, it's clear that this guy should not have been on the loose.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of questions that we have, and I don't know if everybody has the right answers.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's also what we've been talking about, this video, a series of YouTube videos that were filmed, or cell phone videos that were filmed, and I want to talk about that more after the break, but two different people here. Here's a guy who's falling apart. In those videos, you have a guy who's saying, "Today is the day, my wrath will be felt," powerful, empowered. So, I mean, that is going to be really interesting to see how the contrast in those videos plays out. In the meantime, we got to take a quick break. Stick around. Jesse and I will be back with much more right after this. Stay with us. Well, there we heard a bit from Paul Thiesel's attorney saying that he acknowledged what he had done. He was sorry for it. Now, he had originally faced charges of aggravated theft for stealing that more than $2 million from the Warren Fabricating Steel Company while he was CFO. By the way, he had worked for the company for some 38 years, but he ended up taking a plea. Jesse, your thoughts on that? He pled to a lesser count.
Yeah, he pled guilty to second degree. He's hoping for 2 years in prison. Makes sense if the prosecution had a really strong case against them, which is usually the case in these kinds of embezzlement cases from companies. You see it when things are tracked, money, you know, based upon email exchanges, text message exchanges, actual financial records.
Right. There's a paper trail.
Yeah, there's a paper trail. It's pretty easy, so it's clear cut. But you also hear about kind of the things that the judge will have to think about during sentencing. This guy's an older gentleman, never had a record, admits what he did. He had a $400,000 check in restitution ready to give. And you hear the judge, he's receptive to the statements from the defendant as well as the defense attorney, so we'll have to see what he sentenced him to.
Yeah, originally under the aggravated theft charge, he had faced up to 11 years behind bars, but when he pled to the lesser charge, that goes down to up to 8 years in prison. Let's see what the judge decided. Okay, well, there we saw it. Paul Thiesler Jr., 66 years old, the former chief financial officer of Warren Fabricating, a local steel company in Ohio, sentenced to 2 years in prison as well as $400,000 restitution. Prosecutors said he was the company's most senior, the most high-ranking employee in the company. They determined in 2016 that he had stolen more than $2 million from the company. He worked there about 38 years. Jesse, we were just talking about how he had faced a higher charge. He took the plea. Obviously, this, I guess, worked out for him, 2 years, and he could likely get released in less.
Yeah, I think that was a fair assessment, and you even heard the judge say, listen, if I didn't accept the pleas, we wouldn't have any plea deals, and everything would go to trial, which is a nightmare for any court. So it makes sense. I think 2 is very reasonable, given that he pled guilty to that second-degree charge. It's not an easy thing by any stretch of the imagination. This is a guy who's not been in and out of prisons, really didn't have a criminal record. He's 66 years old, going to prison for the very first time. It's scary, whether you're in jail whether you're in prison for a day or 6 months or 2 years. It's not easy.
Right. Well, you know, I think, you know, it is appropriate that he gets some time. It's not like he stole $20,000, $50,000. $2 million is a lot to steal and skim away, and it's surprising to me. I don't know how long the scheme was going on, but that it took this long to find out, because I imagine you can't steal $2 million in just, you know, a month or a week or something. Anyway, okay, we are going to take a quick break. When we come back, much more from Nikolas Cruz, the Parkland school shooter, in his own words, as police interrogated him in the hours after the shooting. We have more of the videotape to show you, so stick around. That is coming up right after this quick break. Jesse and I will break it all down. We're also going to talk about the death penalty on the table. Of course, defense attorneys want it off. The prosecution going ahead with the death penalty. Him tells him, I would do anything for you. I care about you. I'd rip my heart out for you. Remember, I told you that when Mom died. And we see Nikolas Cruz wailing there. You know, what were your impressions, Jesse?
The importance of bringing family members out in these kinds of situations is they open up in a way that they wouldn't have to an investigator. And you have somebody who is really getting to the heart, if there is one, of Nikolas Cruz, and saying, look, I know you thought that when I grew up with you, I didn't love you, I didn't care about you. and trying to be a support system for him. And you know why that's important? It's important because he's letting his guard down. And you have to believe the conversation that he has with a lawyer, with an investigator, with a psychologist is very different than you have with a family member. And it's, for me, as I look at this, as anybody looks at this, it's trying to humanize a monster. That's what it is. It's trying to show that this guy had a life before all this happened. He has family members, but I'm looking more at Zachary. Can you imagine a family member who committed this atrocity?
And these kids have no one else. Their mother died. You know, they were bouncing around with family friends. And by the way, there were some words exchanged that we did not hear. Prosecutors redacted the first part of their exchange, so that could have been details about the actual shooting and attack. But yeah, it's interesting because it does humanize Nikolas Cruz here, right? If you didn't know what had gone on and that she had shot someone, you watch this and you start to feel bad for him sobbing there.
Right, and then you realize what he did and think about all of the people, the family members who lost loved ones. What about their tears? What are they going to do? But I'm really looking at it from the perspective of Zach. Imagine walking into that room. Did you think that that's how your day was going to end? Walking into an interrogation room with your brother is now killed 17 people?
Imagine what it is like for him and probably the threats and everything he has received and, you know, the effect that this has on the rest of the family. There was actually an interesting movie about the effects of school shootings on the shooter's family. Anyway, take a quick break. Much more from Nikolas Cruz when we come back. Wow, what an interesting interview our Bob Bianchi did with Dr. William Reed, who interviewed Aurora movie theater shooter James Holmes. Jesse, a lot of interesting points there. One of the most interesting things was when he talked about James Holmes' reasoning for this. It was almost like a video game. He believed by killing these people, he would get what the doctor said were capital points, human capital points. So now he had 13 capital points from all of his dead victims.
It's pretty scary going into the mind of these shooters, as we also parallel it to the Nikolas Cruz shooting, but trying to understand why these things happen, because that's what people want to know. It's the same thing with the Las Vegas shooting. Everybody wants an explanation for why these tragedies occur, and sometimes the answers for it are not that great.
Right.
Because he gets capital. What does that even mean? I don't even know what that means.
Right,
He
or
said
they're
it
just things that like you wouldn't even imagine. It was also interesting. He said James Holmes really showed no remorse. His mother believed he might have some remorse inside that he couldn't get it out. It seems with Cruz, what we've seen so far, he's pretty broken up over this whole thing, and he's saying, kill me, you know.
Which is different than he was beforehand, where he seemed to be so excited
breaking
for
down.
it.
So, I mean, I don't know if we can call that remorse just yet, but definitely seems to know something. He's done something wrong.
Right, exactly. He was so excited for it beginning, and now he's at least breaking down and understanding what happened.
All right, another quick break. Right after this, much more from Nikolas Cruz's interrogation. Stick around. That video coming up right after this. Well, that's the last of the non-redacted exchange between Nikolas Cruz and his brother Zach Cruz. Remember, prosecutors redacted a good portion of these 12 hours of video interrogation because they are not permitted to release the part that pertains to the actual shooting. That can only come out during trial. During that last clip, we heard Cruz say to his brother, "I'm a failure, dude," and his brother said, "You're lost. You're not right in the head." Jesse, you know, final thoughts on Zach Cruz, the relationship between the brothers, and what we can glean from this exchange?
It's an impossible situation that you put Zach in, because now he has a family member who is one of the most hated individuals in the entire country. And also, I know that he has faced backlash himself because of just the relation, but trying to relate and trying to be there for a man, his brother, who just shot or allegedly shot 17 people, is pretty unbelievable to think about. But it's also a very interesting dynamic to see a family member speaking with this guy right after the shooting. I mean, you're really getting an inside glimpse into what their life was like, and you hear they weren't always close.
Right.
He said, yeah, you were interested in guns. I was interested in skating.
Yeah.
Right. You know, and so they're not close brothers, but they are blood.
They are brothers. They are blood. They, you know, they had the same mother, and they were there as their mother died, and no question, it seems that definitely had a big impact on Nikolas Cruz. Well, you and I have been talking about sort of the contrast between Nikolas's demeanor in these interviews. He's breaking down, he's crying, he's saying it was demons in his head. And video he recorded on his cell phone, a number of short videos he actually recorded in the days before and the day of the shooting. It is a very, very different Nikolas Cruz. We have that video for you now. Let's take a look.
Alright, so here's the plan. I'm gonna go take an Uber in the afternoon before 2:40. From there, I'll go onto school campus, walk up the stairs, load my bags, and get my AR and shoot people down at the main courtyard. Await, and people will die. Today is the day that it all begins. The day of my massacre shall begin. All the kids in school will run in fear and hide. From the wrath of my power, they will know who I am. I am nothing, I am no one. My life is nothing and meaningless. Everything that I hold dear, I let go beyond your half. Every day I see the world ending another day. I live a lone life, live in seclusion and solitude. I hate everyone and everything. With the power of my AR, you will all know who I am. I had enough of being told what to do and when to do. I had enough of telling me that I'm an idiot and a dumb. But in real life, you're all the dumb. You're all stupid and brainwashed by these political government programs. You will all see, you will all know who my name is. Hello. My name is Nick, and I'm going to be the next school shooter of 2018. My goal is at least 20 people with an AR-15 and a couple tracer rounds. I think I can get it done. Location is Stone Douglas in Parkland, Florida. It's going to be a big event. And when you see me on the news, you'll all know who I am. You're all going to die. Pew, 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 pew. Yeah. Can't wait.
Wow, two different people there. The Nikolas Cruz before the shooting and the day of the shooting and days leading up, and after the shooting as he sits crumpled in despair, essentially, in the interrogation room at the police department. Jesse, you know, here he is saying, everyone will know my name. My goal is to shoot 20. He never says anything about a voice here.
No, he doesn't. And I want to talk about this for multiple angles. Number one, he's so brave. He can definitely do this.
Right.
But then he commits the shooting, and then he's afterwards. So it's kind of like reacting to, wow, I actually did this, as opposed to before, he's pumping his chest, I'm going to do this, I'm so confident. But when he actually does it and actually takes the lives of multiple people, it may have hit him. But here's the thing that's interesting to note from what we just watched. He has a flavor of my life means nothing, I'm depressed, I live a lonely life, which is very similar to what we see in the interrogation tape, where he says, I'm nothing, just kill me, I want to die. So there's a similarity, a disturbed individual in both tapes, but a very different attitude in both tapes.
Now, the fact that these videos were recorded, that prosecutors released them, you know, one of the victim's fathers, let's show a tweet from Andrew Pollack. He went on Fox News yesterday reacting to this video. Then he put out this tweet, bogus confession clearly premeditated with plans recorded and broadcasted to the world ahead of time on multiple occasions and in multiple venues. He begged for someone to stop it. The father says, you know what, this whole thing with the voice, it's just a made-up story. And this video proves that. Can we make that conclusion, though?
Sure, we could I mean, we don't know what's really going in the mind of Nikolas Cruz. We can make assumptions. He could very well be playing into the detective's hands and saying, you know what, a voice told me to do this, a voice. But the detective was very smart. We played it earlier. He says, you know, you keep talking about this voice, Nikolas, and there were ways to stop it, but you like the voice. You like the voice. Isn't the voice really you? Because that's the end of the day. He made the decision to go into that school. If this is a guy who made the decision, he knew he was going to be on the news, which is really critical. Right. If he was so insane and didn't think that what he was doing was wrong, why would he be on the news?
Yeah, good point. And certainly in this case, they can't say, well, you know, he was mentally ill, he just snapped. He didn't just snap. He'd been planning this, planning out even, oh, I'm going to take the Uber to the school. Yep. You know, every detail there. As we've been talking about, prosecutors want the death penalty, obviously, in this case. And Cruz's defense attorney, Broward County Public Defender Howard Finkelstein, said, look, they are willing to plea if they take the death penalty off the table. Prosecutors say, no, they won't do that. Finkelstein says, we believe it's in the best interest of the community and the victims' families to end this case now, lock them up forever, throw away the key, don't speak his name. First of all, that just struck me as a little strong coming from the defendant's own attorney to say lock him up forever, throw away the key, don't speak his name.
Right. Look, they realize that if this goes to trial, how much pain is that going to cause every one of the family members to relive the details of it? Let's not also think about the time and expense in putting this trial on, and for what purpose? Everyone knows that he did it.
Yeah.
Right, and the prosecution wants that death penalty because they have such a strong case. And this guy committed a crime that we haven't seen the likes of in quite some time. So they have no incentive to drop the death penalty. To fight it out for death or life in prison, is it really worth it at this point? And that's what makes this a very weird situation, particularly in the shoes of the defense attorney for a school shooter.
I want to talk about one more interesting tidbit I saw online in an interview that the public defender did with the Miami Herald. One of the reasons he said, look, end this, stop publicizing this guy. He says there's a dark online subculture that idolizes school shooters like Cruz. He said Cruz is sent, quote, buckets of fan mail, including from young women who send photos of themselves in lingerie. The lawyer said, though, Cruz doesn't get those letters. But I guess his point was, look, let's stop talking about this. Let's get this out of the public discussion because, you're inspiring this dark online crazy subculture. I mean, first of all, that was surprising to me.
Yes and no. I think when you find disturbed people, you're going to find disturbed people who like them. There's something for everyone out there.
Right.
This guy is a face to evil, a face to a horrific shooting. There are people out there who idolize that. As scary as it is to say, they are people who look at that and want to say, you know what? I want to do what Nikolas Cruz did.
Right, and we know, in other cases that it's common to hear men in prison, they get all sorts of letters. Right. They end up marrying some of these women. I would think, a school shooting is something a lot of people can get behind as something that you actually condone instead of praise. But yes, there are all kinds of people. Jesse, I have loved having you as my guest today on the other side of the table today, but you will be taking over. Jesse's coming over into the host seat. We're going to take a quick break. He will be right back. Much more from Nikolas Cruz right after this break.